All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Your Spiritual Journey. This is Bob Dove, and today I'm very happy to have with me Vince Lisi, coming to us from Youngstown, Ohio. Vince actually has two master's degrees, one from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and that's a master's degree in philosophy. And then the second one in theology, and you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation, Vince, and
From the Athenaeum of Ohio.
Athenaeum of Ohio, thank you, in Cincinnati. Uh, he's a teacher. He works with study groups over Zoom. He's a spiritual counselor and teacher. I've actually known Vince for about 4 years now. I was introduced to him, I guess, through a meditation at a study group that I was working with here in Pittsburgh, Linda Alm's A Course in Miracles study group at the time. And I've then attended at Unity some presentations that Vince did, and now I'm pretty much a permanent member of 3 or 4 different study groups that he runs. So Vince and I are old pals. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself on this. There will be 2 back-to-back episodes with Vince. One that explores his personal spiritual journey. And then the second one will be about now creations. And as a matter of fact, there will be a third episode that will be with John Hoops, who has been with Vince for many, many, many years. And Vince's work and now creations work has changed his life totally. Without further ado, then, I'm going to turn the mic over to Vince and ask him to start back in his childhood with what his spiritual experience was at that point, and then take us up to the present day. It's all yours, Vince.
Thanks very kindly, Bob, and thank you for the opportunity of addressing your audience in this podcast. You asked that I divide the presentation between my personal spiritual evolution and the development of my organization, Now Creations, which I'm very happy to do. But they really are in a sequence. My personal evolution has led to the development of Now Creations. So I'm going to put both of those together. Obviously, the first one, personal evolution, and then to Now Creations. So let's begin with my personal development. I was born in 1944 into an Italian Catholic family and enjoyed both my nationality and religious roots and heritage. My first recollection of a really spiritual development came in 2 ways. The first one was a question that I had as a youngster when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. I remember this very, very distinctly. I was simply in my backyard playing when all of a sudden a question just came to me. And the question was, how did we get here on this planet? Where did we come from? Just came into my mind as a youngster. It's still a question that I have in my own mind. Where did we come from? How did we get here on this planet Earth in this star system? There was a second question that began to be formulated in my early teen years and continues to be present right now. And that is the question of what is really real in life? What is really real? What doesn't just come and go? What can you really count on? Let me give you a simple example. When I was a teenager, I enjoyed playing basketball and watching basketball. And I remember I went to a professional game with the Cleveland Cavaliers up in Richfield at the time. And the star of the game for the home team was Dick Snyder. He made the winning basket, and of course, the place erupted with great cheers. But I thought to myself, what if he went home that night and found that one of his children had died? What would then be the source of happiness for him? Obviously, that game came and went, but his child, very much more deeply connected with him and he to his child, that would be just a much different significance. So I would just keep asking myself, what is really real? It kind of presages in a little bit the introduction from A Course in Miracles, which simply says, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. But I must say, at that stage of the game, I didn't know about A Course in Miracles and what really was real or unreal. But the question, what is really real? What is really real led me to become a Roman Catholic priest. And at the time, I felt that Christianity had answers to the two main questions that I had formulated for myself in my life. At least at the time, they had the answers. The first one, how can you live happily day in and day out? What would be really real so that you could happily live day in and day out? Loving others, learning to be in that loving presence, that really seemed to be very, very real to me. And I enjoyed the answers that Christianity, although it was not the only answer that other religious traditions had also, but Christianity was very impressive to me. Just talked about the reality of love. And then that second question again, what happens when you die? Death always seemed to me to be something that we had to contend with, and we had to answer at some time in our life. And again, Christianity at the time offered the notion of a resurrection, of a life simply beyond the earthly life here. But there were two things that are just a little digression that I do want to mention here. The first one will be that the most significant event in my life, this will come many years later, was the death of my dear sweet wife, Anne. What happened to her when she passed? And I'll talk more about that later. And then secondly, when I wrote my first book, The 10 Most Important Things to Know in Life, the first thing I put as my first most important thing to know in life is to realize that you will someday leave the planet. So what happens to you when you leave the planet? It just seems to me that death was always just something there that was, you just had to contend with, something you had to meet that was going to be coming to you, whether you felt you could lay down your life by choice or whether simply by chance. But let's get back to the priesthood for just a few minutes. I thoroughly enjoyed my 14 years as a priest, being able to assist others in their spiritual growth, and of course, they assisted me in mine. I learned a lot about life, from the very depths to those very low points of life where people just had a tough, difficult situation, to the highs of life and those wonderful occasions, literally from births through marriages, happy occasions, to deaths, and of course, everything in between. You learn a lot when you're in some kind of spiritual ministry. One of the things that I did when I was a priest, and you'll understand this a little bit more later on, was that I always initiated study groups. I always did this. Whether it was forming groups with our high school students, where I began, were adult discussion groups, such as Bible study groups and adult education groups. This formation of groups is really the essence of what we do in Now Creations. I'll talk about that a little later. Let's get back to the priesthood again. As a priest, I became somewhat disenchanted, however, with the third dimensional teachings of traditional Christianity. No problems with Jesus, but many problems with the way the church presented those teachings. Issues such as abortion, birth control, divorce, gender disparity, and especially the heavy emphasis upon sin. It just seemed like we were in a cycle of sin. We just never seemed to get better. There was always sin to be contended with. I realized that therefore it was my time to leave the role of the priesthood, and to pursue the truth of what was really real in another role. Still pursuing the same notion of what is really real, but in another role. After leaving the priesthood, I began a twofold career of being a nursing home administrator and teaching part-time at two local universities, Youngstown State University here in Youngstown, Ohio, and a Penn State branch in Sharon, Pennsylvania. I enjoyed my time as a nursing home administrator and learned a lot. I learned a lot about end-of-life issues, and especially what was really meaningful in people's lives, what was really real over the course of their lives. My time as a university professor was simply a joy. The classes of philosophy and theology that I taught, they were truly my cup of tea. They continue to be my cup of tea. I thoroughly enjoyed each one of our classes, and I feel that our students profited from them. But the most significant event of my life, the most significant time of my life, happened 5 years after I left the priesthood. I married a wonderful, loving soul, my dear wife, Anne. We had 3.5 years of a wonderful union, loving each other and loving our family and friends. And then the most significant event occurred. Anne suddenly passed from a brain aneurysm. One moment she was fine, another moment, literally, she had passed. My life changed in a day. While one has to deal with all of the things you have to deal with a sudden, unexpected death, it was the event. It was the event at the wake of Anne's passing. The event at the wake of Anne's passing that really started me on my larger spiritual quest of what was really real in life. On the night of the wake, before the people came, as I approached the coffin, the question that was brewing on my mind just came forward. Before sharing that question with you, let me say that I never felt that my connection with Anne had ever subsided. I never felt that Anne had died, because our energy was still very much connected, that our spiritual, mental, and emotional energy were not severed simply by her physical passing. This was very calmly apparent, not only in my relationship, but in many loving relationships. Physical separation physical separation is the least of a couple's union. So back to the night of the wake. As I approached the coffin, the question I addressed to Anne was, "Where are you, sweetheart? Where are you? Where are you, sweetheart?" I never felt that Anne's life had ended, even though her physical body had ended. So I wanted to know where she was. At the time of Anne's passing, we were reading a wonderful book by Richard Bach entitled The Bridge Across Forever. The Bridge Across Forever, which detailed his loving relationship with Leslie Parrish. At the end of the book, they talked about how they could astrally project together, how they could go out of their bodies and to meet each other beyond the physical plane. This very much interested me, and I had thought that perhaps Anne and I might do the same. But at the very end of the book, they mentioned the Monroe Institute in Fairbury, Virginia. The year was 1993 at the time. Robert Monroe was a radio mogul who began to have out-of-body experiences. Since Anne was no longer in her body, I thought that the Monroe Institute would be the next step for me to examine not just my relationship with Anne, but also to pursue again that question, what is really real in life? The Monroe Institute then sowed the seeds for Now Creations, which is part 2 of this presentation. When I went to the Monroe Institute, although I personally did not have an out-of-body experience, I had many experiences of higher conscious awareness, far beyond the physical aspects of life, much more into my non-physical aspects of higher consciousness. From the Monroe experience, I began to read many channeled books, chief of which was Emmanuel's book by Pat Rodegast. Emmanuel's book by Pat Rodegast. I then began to invite a few interested people to come to my home in 1995, and my first study group began with 8 to 10 people using channeled books in my home. Excuse me. In 1997, I invited 30 area people to a public meeting, and from this initial gathering, I began what was simply called the Youngstown Spiritual Society. Although the Youngstown Spiritual Society met monthly and did have many interesting speakers, I could see that it was going to have a limited future. In the meantime, my home group began to expand, and we began to meet weekly, publicly, at a local center. Additionally, I began to do personal spiritual counseling, which I continue to do. As the Youngstown Spiritual Society waned, one of my counselees and I continued to advance in our spiritual awareness. And in the year 2005, we decided to start a new organization called Now Creations. The two of us decided in a session that we needed to share our spirituality. Excuse me. that what we were experiencing is what people are looking for, a meaningful understanding of life. And thus we began Now Creations. In fact, on my birthday, March 5th, in 2005. We developed a beautiful name, Now Creations. We took the name from the spiral of the Hubble telescope of our galaxy, indicating that we are creating now as an ongoing creative energy of the impulse of life itself. We are now creations, creating from the impulse of life itself. Our motto was based on a combination of Plato's name for God, which he called the good, and an Indian namaste greeting. Our motto was, the good in me sees the good in you. We were off to a good start. A really good name and a really good motto, both of which were simply the truth. We are the creative impulse of life going on, and the good in us truly sees the good in everyone else. Eventually, our Youngstown study group grew to additional ones, first in Ashtabula, then eventually in Akron. And then we expanded to Strongsville, and then Columbus, Ohio, and then Indianapolis, Indiana, and then Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. I traveled to each of these sites weekly and or monthly, putting 50,000 miles a year on my car. We grew to about 200 active members, which we pretty much presently have, and about 450 on our email list, which we pretty much presently have. Once we began a study group, we never stopped it. This is pretty interesting. So we've had study groups for, actually our oldest one, 23 years in Ashtabula.
Wow.
We just continued to grow, and we would move to another book. We started with Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, and we've continued up to our present offerings in A Course in Miracles, A Course in Mastering Alchemy, Eastern Wisdom, the Tao Te Ching, and one of my present books, What They Know, the experiences of near-deathers and what they encountered. Additionally, at the beginning, we would do a Sunday service monthly in Youngstown, in Akron, in Indianapolis, and in Pittsburgh. The first one we would do in Youngstown, the second Sunday in Akron, the third in Indianapolis, the fourth in Pittsburgh. Needless to say, I got a new car every 3 years just to maintain a safe vehicle during my travels. And then COVID hit. And what a blessing it turned out to be for Now Creations. What a blessing. We were able to make an immediate adjustment from Skype and then to Zoom to continue all of our study groups. And now our Sunday services for everyone could be on Zoom without me having to travel, and none of our groups missed a beat. As a result of Zoom, obviously my travel time was immediately reduced. And Now Creations was able to increase its programming to now what we have, which is 13 programs a week, 13 programs a week, generally 2 a day, including every Friday and every Saturday evening in a program we call Weekend Enrichment. And of course, our Sunday service every Sunday at 10:30. This is where we presently are. We are the best that Now Creations has ever been, and ready to expand and get better. A final but very important comment. Now creations could not have taken place without the support of our members, from those who traveled with me to the various locations, to those who housed us, to those who did and continue to perform our secretarial and technological functions, and especially those of us who attend our meetings on a regular basis, some now 3, 4, 5 times a week. We have grown together and will continue to do so. We have become a holy communion of consciousness. That's really the truth. We have become a holy communion of consciousness. We know who we are. We know what we're doing. Our goal is to love everyone, and in the process, to usher in the kingdom of God. That, Bob, is the presentation that I'd like to make, my personal evolution and a little bit of the evolution of now creations.
Well, I love that phrase, the holy communion of consciousness. I'm going to remember that one.
It's truly what's occurring. We have this clear consciousness of who we are. And we realize that each one of us is really a part of a larger universal consciousness. So that we are a communion, not simply of individuals, but a communion of individuals who have a larger collective spiritual consciousness. So while we will uniquely manifest our soul expressions, those soul expressions come from that universal spiritual communion. Call it the Holy Spirit, the God Spirit, consciousness, whatever.
Yeah. So there are a couple things that I'd like to get into. One is that beyond that first book of What They Know, you have 2 other recent books out, and one I have here, which is, I have to say, my favorite, which is The 3 U-Turns, a guide to higher consciousness. And both of these books came out in 2021, so they're pretty recent. And the other is The 10 Most Important Things to Know in Life. And I'd like to take you back, not too far, because these were published in 2021, and what it was that made you feel that it was time to put these out. Because I did read your statement that you had been urged to write books in the past, and you said, well, everything that needs to be said has been said. I've read all these books myself, and I know that I don't have anything new to say. But suddenly you felt the impulse to go ahead and put these books together. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to do so. The first book was the 10 Most Important Things to Know in Life. And what I felt we needed was a very simple, practical guide. Even though we've read books in the past that have all of the basic information in, there is a vast number of people, maybe 95% of our population, who don't have a clue about those books. But most of all, they don't know how to simply deal with what life has right in front of them. So I felt that it was very important for us to have a very small little book that just says, these are the 10 most important things you need to know in life. The very first one was, someday you'll leave the planet. And it's very important to know that. Many times we have a tendency to look at people look at the planet as a retirement center. You're going to be permanently retired here. And that when someone passes, it seems like, well, they failed to make it into the retirement center, as opposed to understanding that we all will eventually pass. And then, of course, the second one was to be able to understand how you're constituted as a human being. What are the parts that make you up as a human being? So those were the first two things that I felt were very important that most people just don't know. And they proceed on to the importance of having a teacher, the importance of belonging to a spiritual group with like-minded people, and then also a major question, of course, is what do you bring with you when you pass? What do you bring with you when you pass? So that was the first book. The second book was really one I had not intended to write, and that is What They Know, which is the experience of those who have had near-death experiences. And it was really presented nicely in a book. I've read many books on near-death experiences, but there was a wonderful book by Dr. Bruce Grayson called After. And I enjoyed reading the book. Not that it had so much new information, but I thought what we really needed was to have kind of a little coalescing of what the near-death experiencers encountered. And we needed to put that into a book with a vast number of near-death experiencers. So Dr. Grayson gave us kind of like a beautiful summary of near-death experiences. What I was able to do was to put those experiences into 10 nice chapters that we could then discuss what exactly did those near-death experiencers have. So one of the chapters simply is the continuity of life. Of course, most people think continuity of life just means you're going to live after death, which is true. But the real continuity of life is a continuity of consciousness that we had before we came to the planet, where we are presently, and where we'll be heading. The second notion, quite simply, is that there is learning that continues after life here on the planet, just as there was learning before we came to the planet. And a third notion, which is really the creme de la creme, is that not only do you create after you leave the planet, but we are here to learn to create while on the planet and to use the very same qualities that the near-deathers experienced, namely that soul spirit, to be conscious creators in a body here on the planet. So that I just began to see more and more things we just needed to talk about, especially in our groups. I'm not surprised you like the third book the best, because quite frankly, it's at the highest level. And essentially, it just talks about three shifts. The U-turn from a personality self to your soul, the U-turn from your soul to the spirit, and then the U-turn from the spirit to the God Spirit. That is the whole path. Those are the three U-turns we need to make. And then, of course, they come full circle and enable us to live much more fruitfully here in our everyday activities. So that's kind of a little summary of why I wrote those books. I probably could write, several other ones, but what I would especially encourage people to do is to join us in our Sunday service, because our Sunday service is really a continuation of the teachings, particularly the ones at Christmas and New Year's, but the ones over the past year are very, very available. And to attend our Sunday service, all you have to do is go to our website, nowcreations.org, nowcreations.org. Click on Sunday service at 10:30, and I'll pop on at 10:30 with our Sunday service. Plus the fact that all of our Sunday services for the past several years are archived right there. So right after you would click on to the current Sunday service, you'll see right beneath it the most recent, and right beneath that a YouTube to all of our archived Sunday services. So it's very easy to go back, and it's always with the most recent of our Sunday services.
And I
That's kind of a long answer to your question,
no,
Bob, but
that's that's fine. We've got plenty of time. I did want to mention to my audience that also this information will be on our website with links to your website uh, and some more detail about some things you've talked about, and to make sure that people know how they can access your 3 books. So that will also be available on our website for everyone to see.
thank you,
Um,
Bob.
there were a couple things brought up in your books that uh, I just wanted my audience to get a deeper feeling for. Uh, so in the 10 most important things, you talk about the 2 worlds, the inner world and the outer world, and the need to find a way to blend those 2 together. And you give some ideas as to how to do that. So I wondered if you could just give us a little review of that, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, I'll certainly expand on it, probably more than anything else, maybe a bigger review than what's simply in the book. Um, Let me take you back to um, one of my favorite teachers, and I'm much more of a philosopher than a theologian. One of my favorite teachers, and my 2 favorites are really Plato and Aristotle. I kind of feel that they've said it all in many ways. But Plato had a notion very simply that we lived in 2 worlds. The first world is what he called the world of becoming. And the world of becoming is the everyday world in which we're living. It's the everyday world where things come into being, they change, and they disappear. It's the material world that we live in. It's always changing, and it has a very, very limited lifespan. Things come into being, they change and disappear. Probably the easiest thing to say is look in front of the mirror, notice how much you've changed over the years, and eventually you will someday not be able to look in front of the mirror because you will have changed totally. In addition to the world of becoming, Plato had what he called the world of being. The world of being, and that world is immaterial, it's eternal, and it's changeless. It's the world of being. And each one of us, each one of us has a part of that world of being within ourselves, so that we are participants in the world of being, immaterial, eternal, changeless. He simply would call that one soul. Well, we also have the other part, which is our physical bodies and the material world, which is the world of becoming. So for Plato, it was always a question of how do you bridge the world of being with who you truly are into the world of becoming, which wants to take over who you are. So over the years, what I have come to understand in my life is that who we really are is really what I'll call a soul spirit entity. We are a soul spirit. We belong primarily to the world of being. By a soul, what I simply mean is that non-physical part of us that decides what we're going to do in life. And when the soul comes into a physical body, it's the soul that determines what that physical body is going to do. While people sometimes think it's the mind that determines things, it's really the soul that is really the decision maker. The soul is that free, conscious, creative aspect of who we are. That soul, when functioning at its best, is aligned with the spirit. The spirit is that universal collective energy, and that universal collective energy that gives us principles such as the law of attraction or the law of allowing, as well as values such as love and oneness. We really are soul spirits. So the trick is learning to be a soul spirit while here in a physical body. And normally we simply say that's what it means to live fifth dimensionally, to be able to understand yourself that I am a soul spirit, that I am connected to my source energy, that I live by the qualities of oneness and love, and I do all of this in a physical body. To bring those energies into the vehicle of our physical body, which also then combines the mental and emotional bodies with it. So the key then for us is to learn to live from the top down, from the inside out. Whereas most people are struggling living from the bottom up and from the outside sometimes in. So the key for us is to be able to come to know this, and this is where your spiritual evolution is. Evolution or ascension is not wafting off the planet. Ascension, evolution, is an ascension in consciousness, where you move from simply understanding yourself as a personality self, as a physical being in the world, to understanding yourself as a conscious, eternal soul spirit connected to source, the purpose of which is to bring the kingdom of God into manifestation through our creative energies of love and oneness. So as we live day in and day out, our goal is not to diminish anything in the world, but to be able to treat it in two ways. First of all, to bring your highest consciousness into your activities of the world. Can you just imagine how your relationships would prosper if you first considered yourself a soul spirit and bringing that loving energy into a relationship or into your job or into your friendships, your neighbors, going to the store, the bank? So we very much are into the world, but we are not, in a sense, of the world. We pretty well take that admonition of Jesus. We are in the world, but we are not of it. We are of our soul spirit. And then the second thing that occurs is because we are of our soul spirit, we begin to live by intuitions that come to us. Not just intuitions of dealing with the world, but intuitions from within, where that still small voice we hear. So my suspicion, Bob, is you had an intuition to do spiritual podcasting. And you did.
That's true.
It's just the truth. I had an intuition to start Now Creations and write 3 books. So we begin not to take our direction from the world, but more and more we bring the spiritual inclinations from our soul spirit into external expression. We would take well the teaching of Jesus that God's kingdom come, God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, and we would be the instruments of that.
Sounds like a
Again,
big job.
Well, a big job, but more fun. More fun. I mean, isn't that who we are? It would be horrendous if that's not who we were. We so judge ourselves by being a human being in the world, as opposed to a spiritual being having this human experience in the world. And the only reason why we would, I think, do what we do is because it's more fun. It's who we are. You live better. We try to give these three litmus tests to everything we do. Does it make sense? Does it feel right? And does it work every time? And living as a soul spirit, I think, would pass those three tests. Makes sense? Feels right? Works every time. To the degree that we are willing, which means, of course, getting past our old habits, releasing all of the fears, all of the doubts, and learning to live more in the fullness of who we are. And this is really what we're doing. We understand who we are, and we're living this way. Not without effort. Not without effort.
Well, your comment that the soul is in charge and that's where our decisions come from uh, made me think about the concept of choice. Because typically, even when you said of those three things, you start with, does it make sense? And we think of does it make sense as coming from our mind or coming from our thoughts and our brain rather than coming from our heart or our soul. Uh, so when we look at choice and who's in charge, frequently I don't think of the soul being in charge. I think of my mind being in charge. So could you address that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. Um, there are a couple of levels we need to address. Is your mind in charge of putting gas in the car, food on the table, cutting the grass when it was really cold this past weekend, putting on clothes? Yes. Your rational mind, your third dimensional mind, does a good job in handling the normal everyday affairs of the world. That when it comes to what I'll call higher values, when it comes to how you will live your relationships, will you be loving in relationships? Will you be understanding in relationship? Will you be tolerant in relationships? Then the mind, which is really simply a result of past habits. Now this becomes a little complicated, but it's not hard. Our past habits were with the game of separation when we were in lower third dimensional energies where fear, doubt, guilt, and shame took over. So much of this, what is in our mind, is pretty well, in a sense, directed by our past habits. So if someone does something to you, you might maybe not do the same thing in return, but you would kind of put them definitely on the out list. So what's very important for us is to realize that we have a higher decision maker, and that higher decision maker comes from the soul, which does not judge by worldly standards, but judges by higher spiritual standards of love, oneness, understanding, freedom, compassion, etc. So what becomes important for us is to be able to, and you make a very nice point, move beyond simply things that occur in your mind to move inward to what is in your soul and to see the difference that comes from soul direction as opposed to mental direction. It's a big thing for many people. Many people still want to live in their heads and try to function better in the world. all the while suffering, oftentimes because they don't go inward enough. So let's go back to relationships again. Someone does something that ticks you off. Well, then you become mad at them, or you become upset with them, or at least saying, that's the way they want to be, that's up to them. What's the energy within you when you're mad or angry at someone? You begin to realize these lower energies of fear and guilt, separation, cause negative energies from your mind and emotions, which affect negative energies on your physiology. Or then you have, situations of like, what happens when someone passes? What does your mind say when someone passes? Duh, duh. Well, it just happens. That's the way it is. Well, all of a sudden you're saying that which is the way it is for everyone doesn't seem to have an answer. And then, of course, you say, what about the quality of your life here? Not just in relationships, but how you take care of yourself, how you relate to your family members, how you relate to your neighbors. Is there a quality of life that comes from within you that supersedes simply mental development? Mental development, at best, deals with what goes on in the world. It's wisdom from the world. It's kind of like a fourth dimensional notion. We sometimes say the third dimension is when you're just reacting to the world. The fourth dimension is when you're just saying, I'm going to take the best the world has to offer. The fifth dimension is when you take the best that your soul spirit has to offer. And when you take the best of that, then you have answers that the third and fourth dimensions don't give you. They speak to the quality of your relationships, the meaning of your life, what happens when you die, and might I suggest, having much more fun. We would not do it if it were not fun, if it were not the most enjoyable thing to do. Why would you do something that was horrendous, where on the other hand you could do something incredibly enjoyable? Perhaps that will be helpful.
I'm sure it will be.